Hi, my students. How are you all? I hope you are in good condition. Welcome to my English class with me, Mr. Andi Prastio. Today's topic is about asking for and giving advice and suggestions in English. Before going on our main materials, I'd like to tell you information about our learning objective of the lesson. There are 6 learning objectives that I have typed on the slide. You can read one by one. For the first line, the students are expected to show their enthusiasm in the learning process. Number 2, the students are expected to show their good personality and courtesy in the form of interpersonal communications with both teacher and the whole class. Number 3, the students are expected to listen carefully to what the teacher explains about the use and selected phrases for giving advice. Number 4, the students are able to identify the social function from every model used for giving advice. Number 5, the students are able to practice their own expressions of giving advice appropriately or related to the recent situations. And the last, the teacher is able to give reflections about the material has been taught to the student. Let's get started. Later on, we are going to put our more focus on advice. But first, I'd like to tell you about the difference between suggestions and advice in English. You have to know that a suggestion is another good way of giving advice. You can use the word suggest and recommend to make suggestions. And also you can use the modal verb could to make a suggestion in English. These are the examples of using could, suggest, and recommend to make suggestions in English. The first one, you could buy a uniform. I suggest you to buy a uniform. I recommend you to buy a uniform. Those are the same in use to make suggestions, so don't be confused of them. Have you understood? If so, let's look at advice. What is advice? Advice has the same meaning as suggestions, but semantically there is an explicit difference between them. Someone can give advice to others if she or he is in the authority and has a lot of experiences. For example, a parent, mother, or father tells something good to his or her children about how to improve achievements in schools. It is called advice. On the other hand, someone can follow or deny people's suggestions she or he has received. That's the difference between the use of suggestions and advice in English. Advice is more strict and not for suggestions. Let's go to the next slide. There are some common ways to ask for advice in English, because our more concern now is on advice. The first one is, what do you think I should do? Second, what should I do? Next, what do you suggest? What do you advise me to do? If you were me, what would you do? Not would you do, but would you. You have to pronounce would you do. What ought I to do? Do you think that I should? Have you understood so far? If you have a questions, please write it down on the comment sections on this class. Okay, next, later on the next slide, I'm going to tell you about the specific use of the 10 ways to give advice in English, including the modals and the conditionals, imperative, and all phrases. These are the 10 ways to get advice in English. There are a number of expressions which we can use to give advice, maybe also suggestions in English. The first one is should. The second one is ought to. Number 3 is had better. Next is why not, and why don't or why don't you. And then imaginative conditional or conditional type 2. And then the use of would, imperative, how about, what about, plus verb ing, let's and let's not, could and can't. Let's go on the next slide. There are some expressions used to give advice. If you can look, number 1, if I were you, I would or wouldn't. This is the kind of conditional. Number 2, if I were you in your shoes or positions, I would. Yeah. Number 3, you had better or you'd better in short. Next, you should. And then your only options is to. Next, why don't you? And then have you thought about? And the last, have you tried? On the next slide, I'm going to explain you about the use of modals, the modals that usually used for giving advice. They are should and ought to. Should is a kind of modal verbs and ought to is a kind of modal phrase. Yeah, in general, there are 2 modals we can use to give advice. They are should and ought to. Yeah, look at some examples. Number 1, you should come to the teacher office. Number 2, you ought to read this grammar book. On number 1, the sentence used the modal should. And on number 2, the sentence used the modal phrase ought to. I will explain you more about the use of both. Should is kind of modal verbs that is very common for people to make advice and also suggestions in English. That's very common. Yeah, not doubt for you to make with should for suggestions and advice. But for ought to, because ought to is a modal phrase, yeah, ought to is more formal than should. Old-fashioned, and you can use it in writing form commonly, not in spoken forms. And if you want to speak to someone in a speaking form, you have to speak and you have to give the informations with ought to your seniors or the old ones. Orang-orang yang lebih senior dan kepada orang-orang yang lebih tua. Jadi more polite and more formal than the use of should in English. The next slide is a part of giving advice by using a question. There are 3 question phrases we can use to give advice. They are why don't you, how about, and what about. The purpose of using those 3 question phrases is to make advice less direct. We can use the questions to make the person we are advising consider about the advice we are giving them. Okay, and for the example in the sentences, why don't you? Why don't you do this exercise? How about tidying your room? What about submitting your assignments? Please remember the verbs after about is a preposition is in verb ing. Jadi semua kata kerja yang diletakkan setelah about, karena about adalah preposisi, bentuknya adalah gerund atau verb ing, seperti tidying dan submitting. Ya. And I added an additional one, that is why not. The additional phrase is why not. Why not is also used for the negative, but this form is a little different from the other phrases. It is usually used to make more general suggestions. Yeah. If you have ever seen advertisement in magazines maybe, or in newspapers, or on the roads, yeah, why not is commonly used by advertisers, yeah, to persuade the customers, yeah, that something makes different from the other three. Okay? Listen to the examples of using why not. Like this. Why not spend your holiday to Dufan? So the meaning is, the marketing office of Dufan tries to persuade people to spend their holiday over there. Let's go on to the next slide. The use of conditional or imaginative conditional or conditional part 2. Okay, the functions of using imaginative conditional is to put yourself in the person positions. If someone is asking for your advice, sometimes it's useful to imagine yourself being in that person's position. This is a good way actually to explain your advice. Okay. Conditional type 2 is the other name of imaginative conditional. Sometimes it can be something complicated for those who haven't learned about conditional. Okay, so look at the examples. If I were you, I would beg pardon to your mother. So you have to imagine or put yourself in that person's positions, yeah? Here is the use of would. The modal would is one form that usually used to make a suggestions as another good way of giving advice. People can use the verb suggest and recommend after would. For examples, I would suggest keeping on exercising, and I would recommend taking this opportunity. Now, why after suggest and recommend is a verb ing or gerund? Because both suggest and recommend are the verbs that usually followed by gerund or verb ing. Look at the next slide. If you want to give a stronger emphasis, or you want to say something or give advice is a stronger way, it's better for you to use had better. Had better is a model-like forms that give a stronger emphasis if you want to give advice to someone else. Sometimes you need to make your advice more stronger, yeah? To let listeners know that something is really important. For this reason, we can use modal had better. As in examples, you had better start working on your homework, and I had better go now. Verbs that place after had better should be base verbs. Now is the use of imperative. You can use the imperative forms to give advice. Imperative places a base verb as its initial part, as well as the imperative is used to give advice. It can also be used to give an order and a warning. The word please can you use to make a request. Look at the examples. Come here. It refers to advice. Sit down, please. It refers to request. Don't say anything to her. It's negative. And let's have some lunch. Let's or let us can be used before a base verb if you are including yourself in the imperative. The last is could and can. Both could and can are interchangeable in sentences. They are used to give advice, but more stronger to make suggestions and requests. The examples on the right are on question form altogether. Look at this. Could you please open the door? Formal and polite form. And number 2, can you postpone the meeting? Informal and request. Well, before coming to the practice, I'd like to tell you about some forms of expressions used to decline advice. Number 1, I don't know what to advise, I'm afraid. Number 2, I wish I could suggest something, but I can't. Number 3, I wish I could help. Number 4, I'm afraid I can't really help you. Okay, let's look at the phrases on the left. They are used to decline advice in English. So if you are really busy and one of your friends needs some help for something, but you are very busy with so many works, you could say one out of the 4 phrases. Okay? Understood? Now, let's do the practice. Well, please practice your understanding of giving advice by responding to those 5 situations. I assign you to do it both in spoken and written form. It means write the responses on Microsoft Word and record your voice based on what you have written or typed. Send the assignments to my email andiprasetyo1@gmail.com within 2 days. Dalam jangka waktu 2 hari mohon dikirim ya. Oke, ada di slide terakhir itu soal tugas untuk kalian to practice your understanding. Okay, thank you for joining in this meeting. Bye bye.